There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's Sunday the 16th of May, 1993 in Lennox Head in New South Wales, a laid-back coastal town full of families and people in search of the quiet life, away from the hustle and bustle. Bronwyn Winfield is getting her daughters, 10-year-old Crystal and 5-year-old Lauren, ready for bed. It's been a big weekend. Her ex-husband has been in Sydney on a construction job, so she has moved her girls back into the family home. They've been staying in a townhouse on the road out of town for 7 weeks since she filed for divorce. But as winter approaches, it's been getting cold within their new walls. So here she is, taking a stand and reclaiming the Sandstone Crescent property she once shared with Jon while he's away on business. Tonight, Jon is on his way back to Lennox. His flight touches down at 6:30 p.m. Bronwyn has his belongings packed. She has every intention of staying in their marital home, of fighting for the home she's raised her girls in. But after Jon returns home, it's Bronwyn who leaves, alone. According to him, she needed a break and left into an unknown person's car that very same night. That Sunday is the last time the 31-year-old mother of 2 is ever seen again. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. The disappearance of Bronwyn Winfield was barely covered by the media in 1993. It took 11 days for Jon to actually report her as missing after that Sunday night. Very little was done in the way of a police investigation in those early days. In fact, it would be years until her case was actually taken seriously. A coronial inquest nearly a decade later determined that Bronwyn had likely been murdered. It went as far as recommending Jon be prosecuted, but that never happened. Bronwyn's case is the focus of Hedley Thomas's new podcast investigation. You'll remember him from The Teacher's Pet, the investigation into missing mother of 2 Lynette Simms, formerly known as Lynette Dawson in Sydney. She vanished from her Bayview home in 1982, and her former husband Chris Dawson was convicted of murder in 2022 after Hedley went digging and brought the case back into the light. Now, in 2024, he's hopeful of getting some answers for Bronwyn's family. He's speaking to her friends, her family, the police, and the last people who saw Bronwyn before she disappeared. He's currently in the midst of his investigation, but Hedley joins us now to tell us about what he's uncovered so far. So you've spoken to lots of people who know Bronwyn Winfield by now. How would you describe her? Who was she?
Bronwyn was a young woman who was seeking from a very early age the stability of family. She had grown up in a family that became very dislocated. Her own mother had serious mental health challenges when Bronwyn was very, very young. She had postnatal depression, and she also had what was described at the time as a schizoaffective disorder. It wasn't well understood in the 1960s, and Barbara, who is Bronwyn's mum, ended up really just trying to find her own way, no longer being the mother of Bronwyn and Andrew. So she went overseas and stayed overseas with her own mother for some years while Bronwyn was being raised with her brother by their father and their father's second wife, Jennifer. As a result, when Barbara came back into their lives, Bronwyn was already about 11 years old. Andrew was 9, and Andy didn't know that he had a biological mother who had been away all those years. It's unclear whether Bronwyn knew, but the recollection of other people is that Bronwyn did know. In any event, when Barbara returned from overseas and really wanted to play a significant and important role in the lives of her children, she had been replaced by another woman who had effectively been their mother. And it must have been incredibly destabilising for both children. And on the one hand, natural surprise at realising that they had not known of their own mother for so long, and then wanting to understand how that happens, and their natural mother becoming part of their lives, and their stepmother, who they had called mother, perhaps feeling herself somewhat replaced. So I think these must have contributed to Bronwyn's desires when she reached adulthood to forego career, to forego travel, to really just focus on trying to have the perfect family. She just wanted the white picket fence, the perfect little home, happy marriage, and healthy children. And she loved children. She adored kids. She was, by all accounts, a wonderful young mum, and certainly showed no evidence of having any mental health challenges, apart from, it has to be said, she did have some depression, postnatal depression, after the birth of her own first child.
That really sets the scene of her being a real family woman, mother. And she did have a bit of an unusual setup there, because she had 2 children, but then she also brought in Jon, her husband's third daughter, didn't she? Can you help us understand the family unit in the 90s?
So Bronwyn had her first child, Crystal, with her long-term boyfriend, a guy called Mark, and she didn't marry Mark. She married a guy called Gary Beard, and that marriage was short-lived. Then when she met Jon, she had a child with Jon, Lauren, who was Bronwyn's second child. But Jon also had a child from his first marriage. Jon had been married twice before he met Bronwyn, and he had Jodie from his first wife. And Jon and Jon's parents had been looking after Jodie. Jodie didn't grow up with her own natural mother, and that was a source of great regret for that woman, and we'll deal with that in the podcast. But Bronwyn was of the view, when she and Jon got together, that Jodie should become part of their family unit, that she should no longer be living with her grandparents and being raised with them. So she brought Jodie into the family home that she and Jon were trying to create in the Shire, in south of Sydney.
Tell me about the first time you heard about Bronwyn and her story.
I was sitting in the living room of a former Deputy State Coroner called Karl Milovanovich. And Karl was someone I was meeting for the first time a week before Christmas 2017. And I had just been doing some really exhausting emotionally, but also very affecting interviews with people who knew Lynette Dawson, who we now refer to as Lynette Simms. And we were rushing around because I was doing these interviews for The Teacher's Pet. In December 2017, we were still 6 months out from releasing the first episode of that series. But I was trying to do as many interviews as possible in as short a time as possible. And so we drove out there, and Karl welcomed us very warmly. And he was happy to talk to us about the inquest that he had run back in 2003 into Lynette's presumed death. And as a result of that inquest, Karl recommended that Chris Dawson be prosecuted for murder. He also made a ruling that Lynette was dead and had been dead since 1982, when she supposedly, according to Chris, went off to start a new life or do whatever Chris said she was doing. He was peddling all sorts of lies at that time. And Karl, in the course of talking about Lynette, he talked to me about his concerns about a number of other missing women cases. And this was in the context of Karl explaining that the police investigation in Lynn's case was so poor. She was treated just quite appallingly as a a mother who didn't care about her children, who didn't care about her home, her friends, her family, her job, and just took off, runaway mum. And it was stupid. It was a reckless response by police, possibly even corrupt at that time. But Carl made the point that it wasn't that case alone that concerned him. He had dealt with other missing women cases where the police response had been very, very shabby. And he mentioned this case that he had done in Lennox Head. It was mother from Sandstone Crescent, Lennox Head. And he said her name, Bronwyn Winfield. And he gave me a little summary of it. And, I just made a mental note then, and I think I Googled it soon afterwards and realised there was very little on the public record about her. I was intrigued. I opened a folder on my laptop wanting to revisit this case because I had so much respect for Carl and his judgment, and I thought there must be so much more to this. And I couldn't do much at that time because I was so busy trying to do more interviews and investigate leads and so on for The Teacher's Pet. But as the episodes from The Teacher's Pet began coming out, people who were following Lynn's story and, all the evidence of Chris having groomed schoolgirls and having then murdered his wife in cold blood, a number of people who knew Bronwyn contacted me out of the blue, just emailing me and saying, this is one that you may have time to investigate one day as well. This story was very concerning. This case was very concerning. And one of those people was Matt Fordham, who was the senior police officer with the legal degree who handled the inquest when Carl ran the inquest in 2002. So, that's the history of this. A year before Carl had run Lynn's inquest, he'd done Bronwyn's, and it was one of a number of cases that concerned him because there was no rational explanation for the disappearance of both these women, these dedicated mothers.
All these years later, you've been able to actually dedicate time to this case, to Bronwyn's story. I think knowing so much about Lynn's story and The Teacher's Pet, it is very eerie how similar these cases are. Have you found that while investigating them?
Yeah, I really have. And it's almost like parts of them are a mirror image. One key difference is that Bronwyn had separated from her husband, Jon. She wanted to go her own way. She could no longer tolerate aspects of his behaviour. She felt like she was living almost in a prison. The things that she would describe, which we now know as very extreme coercive control, are set out in her own writings. She was in longhand, penning so many points and recollections and aspects of her relationship, her failing relationship with her husband, that when we go back now and read those and think about those, it is a very powerful demonstration of a marriage that is doomed because of the possessiveness and control of one partner. That's how it's represented. Of course, there's always two sides to the story, but we've not heard Jon's. He's preferred to keep that to himself. But the similarities in other ways are very clear. Let's think about the fundamental similarities, the most obvious ones. A young mother with no addictions, with no other potential catastrophe in her life, the sorts of things that could cause a young mother to just lose her bearings, suddenly disappears on the eve of her going to see her lawyer about property settlement matters relating to the fact that she's separated from her husband and she wants to get a divorce as soon as lawfully possible. So she's got an appointment on a Monday morning to see her lawyer. She's already had several appointments with lawyers about the marriage that she wants to end. And on a Sunday evening, the night before, she sees her husband for the first time in several weeks. He comes up to the family home from Sydney where he's been working, building a house. He goes to the house that Bronwyn has been living in with her children, the house that Jon himself literally built with his bare hands. And he agrees that they have an altercation that evening, and he's the last person to ever see her. And she doesn't touch a bank account ever. She doesn't have any further contact with anybody. She certainly doesn't catch up with any of the milestones or significant events in her children's lives. They're aged 10 and 5 at that time. She doesn't turn up for work. Doesn't reach out to her mother, her brother, her other loved ones. And she's just, again, written off as the mum who decided to take off, leaving behind her children, not to mention leaving behind the means by which she could support herself. Equity in a house that was going to be sold. She would have been entitled to perhaps half, maybe even more, because of her care for the children of this house. It was worth $250,000 in 1993. And I think that such a proposition that a woman would just up and leave all of that without warning, without anyone knowing of any such plan to do so, is just so ridiculous. Anyone who thinks that it should be taken seriously deserves to be checked into an embarrassment clinic. I mean, it's just so stupid. And yet that was the theory that the police adopted, and they made some absolutely appalling errors early on when they were being asked to investigate Bronwyn as a missing person. Some errors that you could not fathom would be capable of detectives with some seniority, and yet they did, and they persuaded themselves that she'd just gone off.
Let's delve into some of those details. I want to start with the marriage, because Lennox is a small coastal town. People talk, and by all accounts, it seems that Bronwyn was quite open with a lot of people about her unhappiness in her marriage and what was going on, sharing details. You mentioned a bit of coercive control, but what else was happening in that marriage?
People who visited Bronwyn at the house in Sandstone Crescent were aware that she walked around as if on eggshells while they were there. And that was because, in their opinion, Jon didn't really want visitors at the house ever. He didn't like seeing other people in his house. And he was incredibly particular about any mess. So literally crumbs that were spilled on the floor would have the potential of setting him off, according to some of these people. Bronwyn used to cover the taps at the sink with a tea towel when she was peeling potatoes so that the starch and water and so on from the peeled potatoes wouldn't actually jump onto the taps and potentially show up as a little blemish. Now, that sounds like a personality trait or disorder that, lots of people have. It doesn't make you a violent person. It doesn't make you someone likely or possibly capable of murdering your wife and concealing her body for 31 years. However, it did produce a huge amount of tension in the relationship. It meant that Bronwyn couldn't actually have people over without being very stressed. Her friend, Deb Hall, who lived next door, said that Bronwyn would have friends who she would ask Deb to host at her house. Deb didn't actually have the same bonds with these people, and Deb was only too happy to help. But Bronwyn was terrified that she'd upset Jon, that could trigger him if he saw these friends. Another good friend of Bronwyn's was a woman called Brigida in the Shire, and she described in the early years of the relationship when Bronwyn first started seeing Jon, she described the sort of the light and the happiness that she used to see in Bronwyn just diminishing and being replaced by a sense of unease in Bronwyn. And Bronwyn once told Brigida that she was reluctant to go out driving and visiting Brigida, even though they had been friends for so many years since high school, because Jon would check how much fuel she'd used and try to work out where she had gone. Jon's second wife, who we refer to as Dee in the podcast, she told me that Jon was not violent towards her, but their marriage lasted just 18 months. And she told me that was because he was just extraordinarily possessive. They'd be walking down the street together and she would be feeling the sunshine and thinking, how nice is this? They're probably walking hand in hand. And she said that he would then ask her why she was looking at a guy a certain way. Why were you looking at him? Why were you staring at him? Do you like him? This kind of obviously very jealous insecurity that would lead to disagreements because she wasn't looking at anybody.
The early 90s was a very different time in terms of what we thought domestic violence looked like. We've come a long way in the last 20, 30 years in terms of knowing that it's not just physical, it's emotional, it's financial, it's coercive, it's isolation. Do you think that that contributed to everything going on, that perhaps Bronwyn and her community didn't have a word for it? They didn't understand what was going on or think it was as bad as it was?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because it's very hard to put yourself in that place at that time. You know, we're talking about the early 1990s, and I think we did have a lot of awareness about domestic violence. Certainly things like apprehended violence orders were part of the legal system's response to concerns of women. So we should have been becoming much better educated about these things. You know, Jon emphatically denies wrongdoing, and no doubt he denies that he ever lifted a finger against Bronwyn. But she also did confide to friends like Denise Barnard that he really scared her. Bronwyn told Denise, and Denise told police and has told me that Bronwyn said one day he had put his hands around her throat and was acting in a really threatening way. She was worried about choking. And I think we know from the literature that this is a very serious precursor to much worse events.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Hedley Thomas about the disappearance of Bronwyn Winfield. Up next, we find out why the DPP declined a recommendation to charge the missing mother's ex-husband with murder. When Bronwyn decided to divorce Jon, she was starting to try and create a new life for herself, wasn't she?
Yeah. In late March, Bronwyn wanted to make that break, and she had very little in the way of money. So it was always going to be difficult for her to do this. She didn't have much in the way of her own savings. She has told friends, and she has written down, that she never believed that Jon would allow her to take this house. I know from other people who spoke to Jon at the time of the separation between Jon and Bronwyn that Jon told these people, including a guy called Ian Lewis, or Scruffy the Concreter. He worked with Jon. He employed Jon on a number of jobs, and he told me that Jon had said to Scruffy, "I'm not going to lose another house, Scruffy. I've had 2 previous marriages and I've lost out both times, and I'm not going to lose this house. I'm not going to lose this one." He loved Lennox Head. He was a very committed surfer. Bronwyn was prepared to make the break, and she understood her rights, particularly after she'd been to see lawyers in Ballina and in nearby Lismore. She knew that as the carer for their children, and Crystal was calling Jon Dad, even though he was legally her stepfather, but Jon had wanted to have a relationship with Crystal whereby she called him Dad. Bronwyn understood that when the property settlement occurred, she would have certain rights to the assets of the marriage, as she should. Remembering that Bronwyn had Crystal before she met Jon, then she had Lauren with Jon, and of course she effectively moved Jodie into the family home. So Bronwyn had been a carer for those 3 girls. So she moved into a rented flat in Lennox Head. It was not far away from the family home. And you sort of have to wonder, why did she have to move out? Usually in situations where, there's a family home and a marriage breakdown, and the mother is clearly going to be looking after the children, bearing in mind Jodie had moved to Sydney and was working in a hair salon by then. She was 18 years old. The mother would usually stay in the family home as the primary carer. it's almost always the case that the father, who, unless he's going to be the carer of the children, would move out. That didn't happen in this case, and it's unclear to me why. Andy, who is Bronwyn's brother, is adamant that Bronwyn was effectively forced out. When she said she wanted to separate, his view is that she was effectively kicked out, and certainly the locks were changed soon afterwards by Jon. So while Bronwyn was living in rented accommodation, no doubt she was getting good legal advice, weighing her options. She was working part-time in a little takeaway place down near the beachfront, trying to stay out of Jon's way. He had moved to Sydney after some weeks and was working on a house, building it in the Shire. And that's when Bronwyn decided that rather than paying all this money in rent, she should move back into the family home because it was vacant.
And it's hers as well.
And it's hers, yeah. So nobody was living in it. She'd been paying rent downtown. She could not afford to pay that rent. So she thought, well, I'll save that money and move back in. And her brother was urging her to do that. She got legal advice from her solicitor who said that would be fine. You're entitled to it. And so she did on a Friday evening. A trailer came up and she brought many of her belongings from the townhouse back to her own house. She hadn't finished the move, and I think that's really interesting too. She had a plan to empty the townhouse, to give it back to the landlady, Shirley Taylor, and have all of her things back in the family house, settle her children, get them off to school on the Monday. When she disappeared, the townhouse still had many boxes of her contents, of her belongings, her personal goods. They were just left there. She didn't go back for those after she disappeared. She didn't ever go back to her own house. It's just another, I think, powerful indicator that something else happened to Bronwyn, that she didn't, as her husband has said, leave of her own volition.
What does he say happened that evening when he arrived back at Sandstone Crescent?
He says that he went from the airport at Ballina to the police station, and at the police station on the Sunday evening, he wanted to check whether there were any orders that would have prevented him from approaching the house. And we believe that's because Bronwyn had had a conversation with Jon's daughter, Jodie, a couple of nights earlier. And Jodie has said in a police statement that Bronwyn said, look, your dad needs to be careful about coming near me. I'm getting an order so that he can't. And that must have been related to Jon. I mean, I'm speculating a little bit here and paraphrasing, but that gives you the gist of it. So Jon certainly has gone to the police station and they've said, no, there's no order here, and there wasn't. And we don't know whether it was in the process, whether it had been held up. We're still trying to work that out. But he went then from the police station to the home of one of his daughter's friends and picked her up. He wanted her to go with him to the house when he knocked on the door. He knocked on the door and this woman called Becky McGuire, she witnessed that, and Bronwyn opened the front door and then Jon went in. Bronwyn had his 2 suitcases at the front door. Becky McGuire then was driven home by Jon, and she says that he apologised for disrupting her Sunday evening, and then he went back to the house. He then says that the children were having their dinner and they were put to bed. Crystal says that they usually went to bed at about 8:30 p.m. Jon says to some people that they had a bit of a disagreement, but not too heated. To someone else, he described it as an altercation. Crystal, in her statement when she was 16 years old, says that she could hear them arguing when she was in bed and that her mother was crying and that her mother said that she would see her girls in the morning. And according to Jon, Bronwyn decided that she needed to have a bit of a break and that she told him she wanted to go away for a few days just to have some time because, according to Jon, she'd been with the kids all this time and so on. So he says that she went into the bedroom and she made a phone call or two, and that at about 9:30 p.m. a car drew up and Bronwyn went outside and got into the car and the car drove away. And he didn't see the car, so he doesn't know what kind of car it was. and he certainly doesn't know who was driving it or who she called. And that's the last time Jon says he saw his wife.
And then later that evening, he says he drove the girls to Sydney?
Yes, so he says that he decided that he should go to Sydney, but he'd flown from Sydney to Ballina. So at that time of night, there were no flights. He packed up the car, but he didn't put much in the car because when they got to Sydney, Bronwyn's brother and sister-in-law on the Monday afternoon saw Jon. He came to their house and the kids' clothes were sort of thrown into pillowcases, but the clothes that were packed were not really clothes you would pack for the onset of winter. Bearing in mind the kids were due to be in school on the Monday, not in Sydney. He says that he got fuel at 11:06 p.m. and he kept the receipt for that fuel for years and years in his wallet. And when people would ask him about what happened to Bronwyn, he would often flourish this receipt, as he did when he got to Sydney, as he did 5 years later when he met the Detective Sergeant Glenn Taylor, who started to take this case very seriously in 1998 when he heard about it. And, you know, it's always been puzzling for people why Jon has been so wedded to this receipt showing his purchase of fuel at 11:06 p.m. in Ballina on the Sunday night. But he says he drove through the night and arrived the next morning in Sydney, and he was in Sydney for about 11 days until Bronwyn's brother very strongly insisted to him that he had to go back up to Lennox, put the kids back into school and report Bronwyn missing. And he was becoming very concerned about what had happened to his sister.
Hearing that story, it sounds very bizarre. But the police didn't really question it in 1993, did they?
Not in the way that you would have expected, given the fact that, as Glenn Taylor said, there were red flags flapping everywhere. I mean, Bronwyn had even telephoned her solicitor on a Sunday at home because she was concerned that her husband was returning to the family home that day. She had told people she was very scared of him. One of her friends in Lewis, the man we refer to as Scruffy because everybody else does in Lennox, he spoke to Bronwyn about Bronwyn's decision to move back into the family home, and he said to her, "Bronwyn, I don't think that's such a good idea. Jon's going to lose it. You know, he's not going to like that." They knew his temperament. Scruffy describes him in this way. He says, "Still waters run deep. Jon doesn't show much, but there's a lot going on beneath the surface." And Scruffy was concerned for Bronwyn when she told him days before that she was going to move back into the family home because Jon was away. So you're right. Why would such a case have been treated with such naive disdain as a woman just taking off to do her own thing for a while, when it was very obvious to police over the ensuing weeks that she wasn't touching her bank accounts. She hadn't been in contact with anybody. She hadn't been back to the house. But then they misled themselves, the police. They determined on the most ridiculous piece of evidence imaginable that she had actually gone back into the house after Jon had left the house with the children. And once they'd satisfied themselves of this, notwithstanding that it was completely ludicrous, they, I think, believed that Bronwyn was alive and was just playing cat and mouse.
So what was that piece of evidence which cemented that belief for police?
The police got the phone bills, the phone account, and back then it was telecom, and we used to get these printed bills, and they would print out STD calls, and it's a weird name, I know. It stands for subscriber trunk dialing, and that's the long-distance telephone call that you could make from your landline back in the day. Most people wouldn't have had mobile phones in 93. They were probably just starting to come out, but it wouldn't have been very widely used. On the phone bill, there was also evidence of a number of calls being made to a number that started with 0055. And back in the day, those 0055 numbers were information-related telephone calls. They were services. So if you wanted to check football results, for example, you could ring that number. People weren't just going to the internet just to check stuff out then. The 0055 number appeared on the telephone bill as having been called at 2:13 p.m. on Sunday, 16 January. And that makes sense because Bronwyn was in the house on that day. Jon was still in Sydney. He would soon be boarding a flight to Ballina, and the 0055 call, this particular one, was checking lotto results. Bronwyn didn't have much money. She was trying to make ends meet and no doubt had taken a lotto ticket and was checking to see whether she'd got lucky. However, when the police got that bill, all the details from it from Telecom, now Telstra, for some bizarre reason, they mixed up PM and AM and determined that Bronwyn was checking the lotto results at 2:13 a.m. on Monday morning. And the police had evidence from Jon that he was on the road to Sydney and he had a receipt for fuel having been purchased at 11:06 p.m. the night before. So the conclusion that the police drew from this, which they put in writing in their own internal reports and running sheets and so on, was that the MP, or missing person, Bronwyn Winfield, had become aware that her husband had left the house with the children and so had returned to the house at 2:13 in the morning to ring a number to check her lotto results and then left again.
I shouldn't laugh, but it just feels a bit ridiculous, like you said earlier.
It's preposterous. Just unbelievable that you could screw up something so fundamental so badly. And that leads the police down the wrong path because in their minds, Bronwyn is returning to her home when her husband's not there. So she must be alive.
I want to skip through a bit of the police investigation side of things because we know the 1993 investigation didn't really go anywhere, but it was picked up again in 1998 and it did go somewhere, into an inquest in 2002 that determined that Bronwyn died at the time of her disappearance. But the DPP never picked that up. They never decided to prosecute anyone after hearing those inquest findings. And then you pick up the case in 2024 and we still don't have answers.
Yeah.
When you did come into this story at that point, what did you surmise? That the case had been forgotten all these years, that it was just put into a too hard basket? Why are we in this position?
Well, as a result of me hearing about it from Carl in 2017, and then over the last 7 years, making progress, getting to know Bronwyn's brother and others involved, including the detective Glenn Taylor, who was on the case from 1998 and helped prepare a brief of evidence that went to the coroner, I became aware that after the appalling 1993 investigation, a fair bit of work was done. And Glenn Taylor ran a comprehensive investigation. And then detectives from the Unsolved homicide unit of the New South Wales Police had another look in 2009, 2010. They picked it up again and they made a further submission to the Office of the New South Wales DPP seeking to have Jon Winfield prosecuted for murder, because there's no point police charging anybody if the DPP is not prepared to run a case. So you had in 2003, after Karl Milivanovich's finding, the DPP in New South Wales saying, no, there's no evidence of any crime and we're not going to prosecute this. And when Bronwyn's brother followed up with the DPP's office, he received a letter written by Nicholas Cowdery. The DPP and Mr. Cowdery said that innuendo or rumour can't be a substitute for hard evidence, and he was unable to authorise the prosecution of this case because of the lack of evidence. So that was the 2003 ruling by the Office of the DPP. We know that the police made a further submission as a result of the Unsolved homicide unit's efforts, and that was also declined by the DPP. But I don't believe that we should see that as the final word. The same Office of the DPP, indeed the same DPP himself, Nicholas Cowdery, repeatedly refused to prosecute wife killer Chris Dawson. Now, the first time that Chris Dawson was prosecuted after the podcast and a renewed investigation by New South Wales Police, a judge acting alone said, "I have no doubt about his guilt." So I think there's a lesson here for journalists, for citizens, for society. DPPs don't get everything right, and we shouldn't just accept the view, given that the view is reached often in secrecy. We don't understand what thought process, what reasoning has gone into the consideration of a brief of evidence. We only know that we get a very brief explanation, such as there was insufficient evidence, there's no body. And, I think it's incumbent on journalists, particularly in cases that are as deeply suspicious as this one, to challenge and see if there's more that can be gathered that could lead to a sensible review of the evidence.
Well, that leads us into your investigation, because that's what you've been doing, uncovering more evidence. And I guess the biggest bombshell in your investigation was dropped only recently, a few days ago. You had an incredible person come forward and give you quite mind-blowing evidence. Can you talk us through what the former Lennox resident and former nurse told you that she saw on the night Bronwyn disappeared?
Yeah, I can. Her name's Judy, and she lived very close to Bronwyn and Jon Winfield in Lennox Head at the time of Bronwyn's disappearance. And as you say, she's a nurse. She was living in a house with her 2 teenage children. She was also pregnant, and she was worrying about a miscarriage. And because of her concerns, she says she was up late at night, sitting on a balcony that overlooked the street. This is Granite Street that runs at right angles to Sandstone Crescent, where Jon and Bronwyn lived. And from her vantage point, she could see down onto the road, and she could see in daylight hours into the passing cars. She could actually see inside the cars. And her friend, Kerry McLean, who would visit her, confirmed this, told me that they would often sit out there and would be able to see inside as they're having a cup of tea and a catch-up. They would just be looking down, cars would go past and you could see inside them. So that bit we know. But at night, around midnight, Judy says that the Winfield family sedan, the Ford Falcon, drove very slowly along Granite Street, and she saw the headlights approaching. And unusually, the car interior was bathed in light because the interior light had been left on. For some reason, it was on. And Judy says that the driver was Jon Winfield, and that in the back seat there was what looked like a body wrapped in a sheet. She's described it as looking like a mummy, like an ancient Egyptian mummy, because it was wrapped tightly. The body, if that's what it was in a seated position with the head, which she couldn't see because it was wrapped. And again, I'm surmising that it's a head based on her description, kind of pushed into the corner of the back seat where it meets the back door behind the front passenger seat. And the feet are going through to the center console. And Judy has been haunted by this image that she says she saw about 2 weeks after her birthday. Her birthday is May 1. And Jon Winfield returned to Lennox Head on May 16. He hadn't been living in Lennox Head for several weeks prior to May 16, and his evidence is that he left Lennox Head on the evening of May 16. So it has to be May 16 if she's positively identified him, that she has seen this. And Judy had a lantern on the balustrade thing that was on the balcony there, and she said that this light must have attracted Jon's attention because she says he looked up, and whether or not he saw her up there, it's unclear, but he looked up, and she says he was driving so slowly and she was so sure of what she saw, so concerned at what she saw, and she's very adamant about it. And she gets quite teary talking about it because it's clear she didn't want to see this. So this image from 31 years ago, is etched in her mind. She had a lot on. She'd recently had to give up her job. She was worried about how she was going to support her children. She didn't know whether she was going to miscarry the one on the way. She was going through breakdown of her marriage and had her own health challenges. So there's a lot in her life at that time. She says that when she was told by neighbours in the street that Bronwyn had been reported missing, because it was obvious there was a bit of a police presence a couple of weeks later, detectives turning up at the neighbour's house, Deb and Murray Nolan, and also at Jon's house to chat to him. She asked the neighbour, what's going on? And they said, Bronwyn's been reported missing. And that's when she thought, oh, my God. And she went to Ballina Police to report it. She said she was taken behind the counter of the police station and they didn't take a statement from her. She says they couldn't have been less interested. And, this is just speculation, Gemma, but I wonder whether it's because the police thought, she's pregnant and she got all her marbles. We already know that Bronwyn's come back to the house because we've got evidence of her making a phone call and checking her lotto numbers. And Jon has shown us evidence that he's on the road. So, it can't be right. I mean, is that possible that they've just discounted her version because they preferred his? We don't know. It's probably going to be impossible to find out. I do know, though, that Judy confided what she saw to some friends, some people who were close to her. She confided it to a woman called Kerry McLean. And that's how I knew about Judy and her account before Judy contacted me. Kerry McLean, her friend from Ballina, who hadn't seen Judy for years, they'd lost touch. Judy had contacted me 18 months ago to tell me about her friend who had witnessed this and had been really concerned about it. And when I telephoned Kerry earlier this year, when I started properly investigating Bronwyn's case for the first time and trying to do interviews and following up all the emails and leads that I've been keeping over the previous 6.5 years, Kerry agreed to do an interview with me, and she talked in that interview about what Judy had told Kerry over the years about this. And Kerry said, I was so concerned about it that I, Kerry, also contacted the police and said, you need to talk to my friend Judy Willibrands. Her name now is Judy Singh. She had a lot going on in her life. I think she reported it to police, but I wasn't there. I don't know. Please follow up with her because this case is unsolved. And Kerry says she never heard back from the police herself, and it seems Judy wasn't contacted either by police. Judy probably didn't know Kerry had even done that. But when Judy contacted me on June 9 by email, as soon as her email arrived in my inbox, I had an understanding about what it would be about, even though she didn't say in the email. She just said, I saw him leaving on the night Bronwyn disappeared. The interior light was on. But because of the background I had from having talked to Kerry 6 months earlier, I appreciated the significance of this. And I had been trying to find Judy, but because of the moves and changing her name, she was living with her daughter, she was a bit hard to track down. And I didn't tell her for some time that I already knew all about her from Kerry. She was quite surprised, but then she wasn't, because she said she confided this to a number of people. And I spoke to Kerry about her veracity, her credibility. Kerry told me that Judy was a very reliable person. She would not tell tall stories. She was highly credible. She was a career nurse, a very dedicated mother herself. And I found that too when I spoke to her at length, initially over the telephone in recorded interviews, and then I met her in northern New South Wales. She's, I believe, a woman who's sincerely sure of what she says she saw.
What's the reaction been so far to the podcast? Are police taking your evidence seriously?
I believe that they are. They wasted no time in wanting to reach Judy Singh. So within a couple of hours of the episode 7 dropping, I got an email from an Assistant Commissioner of Police, Nick Fitzgerald, seeking Judy's contact details. I handed those over immediately. I'm sure that they're going to get a very detailed statement from her.
Obviously, with The Teacher's Pet, with Lynette Simms' case, there was an ending. There was justice. We've got someone behind bars. Are you putting pressure on yourself this time to see a similar outcome?
I don't feel like I'm putting pressure on myself, but I hope that if the evidence puts pressure on those who should be reviewing a case that was always deeply suspicious, then that's a good thing. I can't force an outcome. I can only be the messenger in showing things that have happened, evidence that perhaps was not properly considered, facts and details that make no sense. I don't believe that mothers just willfully, without any extreme events in their lives, walk out without any warning on their young children. I don't believe that that happens unless there's some intervening event. Of course, there will be cases of women with very serious personal issues, perhaps addictions or other external events that have distorted their judgment and caused them to do something extreme. But they're very, very rare, and they're different to what we're talking about here. Bronwyn didn't have any of those issues. She had appointments and plans. And I just think we have to go back to our common sense and our understanding of the incredible bonds that young mothers have with their children and ask ourselves, does this pass the smell test? Does this seem plausible?
I'm talking to you in the midst of this investigation. You're still uncovering leads, you're still talking to people, you're still putting out episodes. I spoke to you after The Teacher's Pet, after everything had died down, and you, in retrospect, spoke about how hard it was, the strains on your marriage, the strains on your time, the lack of sleep. Do you feel like that's happening again, or are you able to put a bit more boundary around your investigation this time?
Well, where's my wife? She's still here, No, the marriage is solid. Other strains certainly are always present, and, you can't do this without making very heavy commitment. But, there's an end point, and if you just put your head down and soldier on, you reach it, and then you can step back and leave it to others. I think that this is a really important case. And these cases, as they become better understood by the general public and as listeners delve into the details and appreciate what's gone on and the dynamics of relationships and also how the criminal justice system works and sometimes, sadly, doesn't work, there's an impact on many other cases that are potentially just waiting to be properly understood. There's an awareness that leads to those cases hopefully being renewed, hopefully getting the attention of people other than myself, people who will look at those cases with fresh eyes and maybe give some justice to the victims and their families.
Well, you're only one man, one journalist, one team. You're obviously looking into Bronwyn's story, you've looked into Lynn's story and quite a few other women's stories. But I can't help but think how many other cases there are out there that are similar, where it's women that have gone missing and something potentially more has happened and it hasn't been investigated. Do you think about that a lot?
Yeah, I do, Gemma. And what I hope is that many, many more media organisations and journalists will dedicate resources to investigating those. I get now dozens of emails a week from people asking me to address a range of terrible crimes. They're not all missing women, but a number of them are. But I can't find enough time to dedicate to Bronwyn's investigation, let alone picking up so many others. You can only really do one, maybe 1.5 a year and do them well. So it would be good if many more journalists were doing these, because I'm sure we would see more outcomes that have been denied the families.
And lastly, I just wanted to check, obviously you're getting to know Bronwyn's family, you've gotten to know them very well. And what are they hoping to see from this investigation?
Well, it depends on which part of Bronwyn's family you're from. Bronwyn's eldest daughter, Crystal, is, I think, in a very difficult place where she wants to maintain a relationship with her sister, and her sister has a very strong belief in the innocence of her father. And then you have Bronwyn's brother, Andy, and his wife Michelle and Bronwyn's cousins, who have been very, very sure for a long time that the coroner, Karl Milovanovich, got it right and that Jon should have been prosecuted for murder. And, of course, Jon's eldest daughter, Jodie, who wasn't related to Bronwyn, she believes emphatically in her father too. So, there is quite a bit of division there. I don't have direct contact with Jon's youngest daughter, nor with his oldest daughter, but I have had contact with Crystal, and I've completely respected her wish to remain detached from the podcast. There's been no pressure at all from me on her to be part of it. Her family, her uncle Andy is keeping her briefed, and her auntie Kim, who was Bronwyn's half-sister, is also keeping her up to speed with everything. I hope. I don't know exactly what they're briefing her on, but these podcasts and the very rawness of the detail that comes out, it must be incredibly disruptive for families. And I feel for those who are affected by it from all sides of the family.
But sometimes it seems you need a disruption like this to be able to push for justice.
Yeah, well, I think that if Bronwyn did meet with foul play, then it is a terrible thing. And it's made worse by the characterisation of Bronwyn as a reckless, uncaring mother. She was anything but. Everybody who I've talked to tells me how committed she was. She was like Lynn, lived for her kids, would do anything for them.
Now we just got to find out what happened to her. Thanks to Hedley Thomas for assisting us to tell this story. You can find the Bronwyn podcast linked in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Bath, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Liv Proud.